Well, thank you all very much indeed. Can you hear me at the back? Super, great. I last came here when I was doing research for this book, and this incidentally is the English edition, the only one I can find at home, which is similar. I mean, it's the same, exactly the same, except I think they've changed the spellings a bit, but it's called Exactly in America, in Britain. And The Perfectionists, I think you told me, Satsi, that there was a novel by a sort of bodice-ripping novel called The Perfectionists, which came out, chick lit. I'm not quite sure what chick lit is, but anyway, came out at about the same time. So I think the Brits actually got it right. But anyway, just thought I'd bring it along for curiosity. The other weird thing is that there's well, you will have noticed it, a police car with flashing lights outside. And the last time I gave a talk anywhere where there was a police car with flashing lights was in our local, the next village to us in Massachusetts called New Marlborough. And the reason was because I was interviewing Garrison Keillor. And Garrison Keillor had lately been outed as being some sort of a pest, I think. And there was a huge amount of opposition to him being allowed to come to the Berkshires. And so there were demonstrations saying Winchester must be stopped. He must not be interviewing this bounder, and Keillor go home. So when I rounded the corner and saw this, I thought, oh my God, you know, is there going to be a riot or something? Am I in trouble? But I'm not sure why he was there. It was just something to do with the broken bridge or something. Anyway, it's jolly nice, policeman or not. And thank you for there being so many of you turning up on a wonderful, crystal clear autumn evening. Most of you, I dare say, are Americans, and indeed I am now, though I wasn't always. I became a citizen in 2012, I think it was. And up until that point, people would always make fun of me on July the 4th, because, you know, we kicked your ass and things like that, and nasty remarks like that would be made. But July the 4th, 1776 is important for you, and now for me. But oddly enough, another very similar date, May the 4th, 1776, is hugely important in this story. And I'm not going to say I wonder if any of you know why, because you probably do if you're visitors, frequent visitors to this museum. The 4th of May 1776 was really the birth of precision engineering. And if you don't know why, this is the reason. James Watt, who had been labouring mightily up in Scotland to build a steam engine that worked properly, and exasperated not being able to do it properly, came down to Birmingham and built a small factory and tried tremendously hard to make a steam engine that worked perfectly. And it worked pretty well, except that the cylinder, you switched it on, you lit the fire, the water started boiling and all the rest of it, and the steam started to emerge. And the piston would go down and gouts of steam would go everywhere. It was clearly incredibly inefficient because the piston rattled around, woo, like that, actually. And the way they built cylinders in those days is that they took a sheet of iron and hammered it and hammered it and hammered it until it turned into a round thing circle, and then welded it together and then upended it and put in the piston. But, you know, if you can imagine a thing that's being hammered is not going to be, with any degree of precision, a perfect circle. And so the steam would inevitably come out of it. It would leak, it would look awful, and it would work very inefficiently. And the dream of being able to, you'll know the ratio better than I, but when you boil water to 100 degrees Celsius, it expands by, 1,680 times and turns from liquid phase into gaseous phase. And the idea that you can turn this expansion into work was just one of the sort of magical ideas that someone needed to exploit. Trevithick in Cornwall did it, not very well, and then James Watt tried really hard, and he couldn't quite get it because he couldn't make the cylinder perfect. But then he heard about this lunatic in North Wales called John Wilkinson, John Iron Mad Wilkinson, who was obsessed with everything to do with iron. And furniture was all made of iron, and his spoons, and spoons and knives, reasonable, I suppose. He had a coffin made of iron in which he was indeed buried under an iron obelisk somewhere in the Lake District. But he had a contract from the Royal Navy to make cannons, and the way he would make them was to get a block of iron and drill a hole painstakingly into it, such that the ball, when you put it in, would come out efficiently rather than wobbling about as it went down the hole. And James Watt thought maybe this is the way to make a cylinder. So he took all his contraptions, the bits and bobs of a steam engine, and you can imagine how difficult it would have been in, 1776? So no real roads between Birmingham and North Wales. He eventually got all his kit up there, near Colwyn Bay, I think it was, and explained what he wanted. And Wilkinson said, yes, I can make a cylinder for you. And so made this thing. It took a couple of days to grind this huge piece of iron, which they then turned it on its side and lowered the piston into it. And lo and behold, the machine worked perfectly. No steam was leaking out of it at all. And as far as James Watt's business was concerned, they were off to the races, because once you've got a steam engine, then you can apply that energy to almost any industrial process imaginable. And the reason I bring this up, first of all, is that the tolerance between the outer edge of the piston and the inner surface of the cylinder was the thickness of an English shilling, which is 1/10 of an inch, or at least it was in 1776. So 0.1 of an inch. And that sort of figure, this is long before I'd thought of writing the book, but I just remembered that this figure was an interesting figure. My father was a precision engineer. He made tiny electric motors for the guidance systems of torpedoes, so very, very small machines. And he loved the idea of precision, and he dealt in things that were, you know, a thousandth of an inch, a 10,000th of an inch. And I remember vividly one, and this is how I actually begin the book, so if any of you have read it, you'll be familiar with this little story. I remember it must have been December, it was cold, we lived in North London. My father came home from the factory in which he was working with a box, a wooden box, which he put on the dining room table. My mother was a very fastidious Belgian lady, and the table was covered. She came from Ghent in Belgium, and centre for making lace. And so this was a beautiful, perfectly white lace tablecloth. And my father slapped down on it this wooden box and immediately started removing from it, and it had red velvet inside, I remember, about 101 steel, shiny steel cubes, basically. They weren't all cubes, but the big ones were cubes, and then they got smaller and smaller and smaller until they were little sort of feuilletons of steel. And he would put them on the lace, my mother thinking, please don't, because at least picked them up, and he started sliding them. And but my mother was going berserk, because of course there was oil and machinery and all sorts of things she didn't like. But he showed me these things, which you'll be familiar with, they're called gauge blocks. And I had no real idea what they were, but he picked up two of the biggest of them. So if you imagine polished steel cubes, and he put one on top of the other. So each one was about an inch thick, one slightly smaller than the other. And he said to me, okay, here they are, pull them apart. So I held the bottom one and tried to lift the top one off it, and it wouldn't come. And I said, it's magnetic. And he said, no, don't be silly. Stainless steel doesn't get magnetized. So it's not magnetism. Try and pull them apart. And I said, Dad, I really can't. I cannot do it. And he took them as just playing a joke on me, but he said, well, the reason that they're not pulled apart is that they're so precisely machined, they almost bond molecularly. And the only way you can get them apart is by a process called ringing, W-R-I-N-G-I-N-G, where you slide one off the other. And then once you know that, then it's fairly obvious. But I became obsessed with the idea of owning gauge blocks, which are a beautiful thing. It was oddly enough, my editor in London, the editor of this particular book, said that she's now given gauge blocks, which are not terribly expensive to buy, mostly made by a firm in Japan. And for about $100 or so, you can get a decent set of gauge blocks. And children apparently love them and play with them. But they're a very important thing. I'm sure their museum is filled with gauge blocks. But anyway, so I've got two things in my mind now. That the tolerance of James Watt's and Iron Mad Wilkinson's cylinder was 0.1 of an inch. And these gauge blocks, which were so beautifully machined that they wouldn't separate the one from another, must be in the thousandths of an inch. So this possibly provides a structure for a book about the history of precision engineering. And Setsko was very interested in this idea as well, and she talked about how you'd structure such a book. And for me, writing non-fiction books, there are three things which, to me, are very important. The first is the idea. You've got to have a good idea for a book, obviously. And number three is that it's got to be written as well as you can possibly write it. But that's not the second most important thing, in my view. The second most important thing is the structure of the book. And if you structure the book badly, then no matter how good the idea, no matter how beautiful the writing, people will just go to sleep. But if you structure it well, then you've got the possibility of a book which sells reasonably well. So I had in my mind the idea that you could structure a book on engineering based on an ever-increasing or diminishing, I never quite know which, of the tolerance of the things you're writing about. So you write about things with a very loose tolerance of 0.1 of an inch and go all the way, chapter by chapter by chapter, 0.1 of an inch, 0.01 of an inch, 0.001, 0.0001, until you get to, I mean, modern degrees of tolerance in things like iPhones. You're talking about 0.1 with 20 zeros in front of it. So that seemed to provide a decent structure. And I'm actually going to ask my wife, can you go and get the bag out of the car? Because I think I've left the thing. I don't need it now, but do you know what I'm talking about? The Colin Povey.
Oh, yes.
Although I'm not sure that it may be in the hotel room, in which case it doesn't matter. Don't go back to the hotel. But a man that made this thing that if Setsko gets it in the car, I've got a funny feeling it's not going to be there. Actually, I think it is. Anyway, check. He got in touch with me with some. He was a very, very interesting, strange man, and he now lives in Florida, and he's a scientific glass blower. He's very interested in making retorts and strange distilling apparatus and things, and beautiful models of ships in glass. Actually, he made a model of I became a citizen on the afterdeck of the USS Constitution, which is the big warship, sailing warship in Boston Harbor. And he did a beautiful glass model of that. And so I rang him to thank him for this incredibly interesting letter he sent me. And I said, I'm wrestling with the idea of how I write this book. And he said, yes, this idea of doing it according to the tolerances and making it ever increasing tolerance as you go through the book is probably a winner. So that's how I structured it. And what I'm sort of going to talk about now is some episodes in the making of the book. Well, the first thing, and I'm not going to crave your indulgence, but this book was written now 7 years ago, I think, and there have been 2 or 3 books since. So if some of the details I'm a bit hazy on, I'm not going to go to it and check up, but I may be a bit fuzzy, so bear with me. But the first real instance of using precision in a major engineering project, which then had extraordinarily interesting social consequences, came very soon afterwards in the early 19th century. So you've got James Watt's steam engine, which can now power sort of any process you want. And the process which suddenly occurred to the Royal Navy, there's a lot of military stuff in this, was the idea of blocks, as in blocks and tackle, which the Navy, in those days, being composed entirely of sailing ships, needed lots and lots of. This was the beginning, 1805 or so, of the sort of big imperial push. It is back in the hotel, isn't it? Yeah, sorry about that. You have to come to the hotel later tonight, I'll show it to you. So a square-rigged sailing ship would have about 1,400 of these wooden blocks which enable sailors to lift up sails and so forth. I think you know what they look like. They're made of wood. They've got iron sheaves, iron wheels in the middle of them, and the ropes go around them. So if a sailor wants to hoist a sail which weighs a ton, then you'd have a big block with 8 wheels, and you pull it, and each pull you're only actually exerting 1/8 of a ton's force. So you can lift a lot very, very slowly. But so these wooden blocks were hugely important to the Navy and needed millions each year. And they were made, generally speaking, by craftsmen in small cottages all over South England. There were 300 or 400 such men who were employed in cutting, presumably cutting down trees, mainly ash trees, I think, and fashioning them into blocks and then drilling the holes in them. And it would take several weeks for each, for the big blocks. I mean, one with a single wheel in it wouldn't take very long. And one of the people that was interested in engineering the applications for using James Watt's steam engine was a man who worked in the Navy. And he said, I think we can mechanize the manufacture of blocks, as in blocks and tackles. And the Navy became very interested in this idea, and he said, how many steps does it take to turn a chunk of an ash tree into a working block? And they said, well, you first of all got to cut the tree down, then you've got to slice it into cylinders, and then you've got to chamfer at the edges of it, shape it, drill holes, the number of wheels you want to put into it, and 43. It took 43 stages to go from a tree to a series of blocks. And he said, okay, well, in that case, I will build you 43 machines. Each one will do one of the processes. The first, you put a tree in, and you cut it into chunks. Then the second one will take off the bark and chamfer it. Number 3 will drill holes in it. Number 4, and so it went on and on and on and on and on. And then at the other end, 43. After 43 machines, you should get the blocks produced. And so he did just that. And they built a factory in Portsmouth, which is a big port in the south of England, where most of the Royal Navy was then, and still what remains of the Royal Navy still is today. And he created something called the Royal Navy Portsmouth Block Mill. And there was a huge James Watt steam engine outside, looking just like the one that he had made in Colwyn Bay in North Wales in 1776. Only it was a very big one, connected with the flywheel, connected to a big leather strap, and it went inside the factory. So every one of these machines was connected to it, and so one machine had a blade which did this, and another had a drill which went like that. And the result was, when they started it, all you had to do was to light a fire under it, and with coal, presumably, or wood. Once the water was boiling, the machine would start going, the steam engine would start going, and all these machines would start turning, and you'd pour logs in at one end, and miraculously, out of the other end would be finished, polished, varnished, precise blocks. The Royal Navy had employed, I think it was 450 workers in these cottages all over England making these things. Once the factory was up and running, they only needed 6 men. 6 men just with cotton rags and things to make sure that each of the machines was oiled and lubricated and working. They were supervisors. They had no knowledge of how to cut anything. They had no knowledge. And so the social impact of the Portsmouth block mills, put 450 craftsmen out of work almost overnight. And it presaged, if you like, the beginning of the social impact of precision engineering, which in this book I accept, not least because my father drew his income from it. The precision engineering is a good thing, and it allows us to have aeroplanes and motor cars and all the rest of it. But it does have a social consequence, and that's, I think, hugely important, and I write about it a great deal. So moving on then from the Portsmouth block mills, and I should say the quality of the machinery of those 43 machines that were made, They started running in 1806. They were still running when the last Royal Navy sailing ship required some blocks, and that was in 1968. So, and now it's a museum. So you can go and see it next time you go to Portsmouth. I urge you to go and see it. It's a wonderful, remarkable place. So, yes, I have to look at this because the book was written 7 years ago, 8 years ago. Then and this is where the American Precision Museum comes into play, because the idea of making large numbers of things all exactly the same. And before I leave this thought, I should perhaps mention the difference between accuracy and precision. I mean, this is the American Precision Museum, but the word accuracy is often sort of connected loosely with precision. What is the difference? And there is a difference. Accuracy is how close something is to your intention. If you have a dartboard, it is your intention when you throw the darts to hit the bull. Precision is not necessarily the same. It's doing the same thing over and over and over again in exactly the same way. So it needn't necessarily be close to your intention. It can be maybe 2 degrees off, but if every dart hits 2 degrees off and such that one dart splits another dart effectively, then that's very precise. And that's why in the matter of gauge blocks, each gauge block would be perfectly made and perfectly similar to the previous one. With accuracy, it's getting to where you want it to go. Precision, it's wherever it happens to go, but making sure that every other one afterwards goes to exactly the same place. This was important at a meeting in the early, actually it was 1785, so it's a bit earlier than actually the building of the Portsmouth block mills, but hugely important. And it took place in Paris. Once again, it involved something to do with defense, and in this case, not a ship, not a sailing ship, but a gun, a flintlock musket. You would know that before rifling and so forth in rifles and before self-contained cartridges, the way that a person fired a gun was you have a flintlock, you ram powder down the end of it, you put in something you want to propel towards your enemy, and then you cock the flintlock, which when you pull the trigger strikes a spark against a piece of flint and ignites the powder, which then explodes and sends the bullet. A flintlock has the flintlock mechanism itself has about 12 parts. If you're on the battlefield and it doesn't work, because they often didn't work, they failed very, very frequently, the person with the gun would say, shoot, my gun doesn't work, and his sergeant or whoever would send him to the gun maker, who might be 100 yards away, half a mile away, get a replacement. And it would be irksome, and it would be time-consuming, and it would be dangerous if you were under fire. So this Frenchman, whose first name I can't remember, the last name is Blanc, said, we can actually make flintlocks in a different and more efficient way. How many pieces in a flintlock? And so there's the trigger and something called the frizzle and the pan and 10 pieces. And he said, okay, but I'm going to make lots and lots and lots of these pieces, and every one will be the same. And in other words, I will apply precision to making these things. And they will all be, and this is a mantra which pervades the stonework of this museum, they'll be interchangeable parts. So if you break the trigger on your gun, it doesn't mean you've got to throw the gun away or go and walk to the gunsmith to get a new gun. You simply replace the trigger because you know what you're replacing it with is exactly the same as the one you've broken. It is interchangeable. So there was a demonstration of basically in the basement of a castle in a chateau in central Paris in, I'm going to say 1785, so I will, I think that's what it was. And Blanc was demonstrating this to a group of people from the French army and various other swells. He had a box of triggers, a box of frizzles, a box of pans, a box of all these various bits and bobs that made up a flintlock. And he said, gentlemen, just take anything, they will all fit together. And then attach them to this gun and fire it. And every time it worked, because all the parts were interchangeable. Well, in the meeting was an American, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was minister to Paris at the time, and he was fascinated by what he had seen and wrote a letter, sort of a famous letter, to his colleague back in Washington, the Secretary of State, and said, I've just seen something quite amazing, which I think should be applied immediately with dispatch to the way we make things in America. And instantly the word went out, once again, to defense organizations, the Springfield, Massachusetts Armory, and the armory down in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, that henceforth the making of guns would use this method, that all the component parts would be identical, and then you just put them together and Bob's your uncle. You'd make guns much more quickly, much more efficiently. The chap that was in charge of the operation, and I think I've got this right down in Harper's Ferry at the time, was Eli Whitney, the cotton gin man. But unfortunately, he did things basically he was a bit of a shyster. And I know he's heroic in American school history, but he cheated on this and he put pre-made flintlocks into rifles and pretended that they had been handmade or using interchangeable parts. And the Pentagon, such as it obviously wasn't called the Pentagon back then, was onto him fairly swiftly. And he never got any more defense contracts. He got agricultural, excuse me, contracts, but no defense contracts. So there we now have the beginning in the early part of the 19th century, both in Britain and in America, but much more enthusiastically in America, of a new way of manufacturing things using interchangeable parts. Let's fast forward to the middle of the 19th century and the birth of two men, same year, different places, one in, I think, Ohio and one in Liverpool in England, both called Henry. Henry Royce and Henry Ford. And both of these people were fascinated as they grew up. First of all, they were both keen bicyclists, and then keen adopters, early adopters of mechanical propulsion in vehicles. They both, coincidentally, because they weren't in touch with one another, bought French quadricycles, which were powered by I think it was a 2 horsepower petrol engine or gasoline engine, completely unsafe, enormous fun to ride, go like a rocket, polluted everything. But these two men in the countryside of Ohio, in the countryside of Lancashire, would roar around, falling in love as they did so with the idea of engines and possibly creating things which would transport people in large numbers. And they both, as they grew up, decided that they would apply their fascination, their obsession, to making motor cars. But they did so in two very different ways. And it's interesting, this sort of bifurcation that happened in the world of precision engineering. Henry Royce decided that he wanted to make the most perfect piece of mechanical, precise machinery it was possible to make, no matter the cost. And he labored mightily and produced, eventually, after many, many iterations, a car in the early part of now the 20th century, which was so impeccably made, it would, in theory, apart from friction, last forever. It would run forever. And the apotheosis of all of this was the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, of which I think 3/4 of the ones ever made are still running today. And they achieved them, and they had huge engines, huge lights, everything about them was big and solid, but impeccably made. I remember going to a Rolls-Royce factory once where they were still hand making them. Now they don't, because we unfortunately ran out of money and it belongs to the Germans now. And so the Germans do not take as much care with the brand. But I remember seeing a crankshaft, and the man who was making this crankshaft through an 8-cylinder V8 Rolls-Royce engine. And he said, look, he was testing the balance of it. He would file small pieces of, as you know, crankshaft goes like that. And between 2 points at each end, he would start spinning it. And he said, I'm going to start spinning it, and quite honestly, it'll never stop spinning, because no one side of it is heavier than another, which will cause it to slow down. The only thing that will slow it is friction at these two ends. And he did it by hand the moment I came into the factory. And when I left, having gone to watch radiators being made and paint jobs being done and so forth, it was still going. No power had been applied to it. It was just so perfectly balanced. It was such a precise piece of kit. And men like that, I mean, it was a joy to behold. They loved what they did. And most of a Rolls Royce, as you probably know, is made by hand. And as I say, the loving intention was borne out by the fact that these machines worked extremely well and lasted forever. Funnily enough, this is something of an aside, but I used to be a journalist, and I was doing a piece in I think it was the mid-1990s. We had just joined the EU, I think, and the editor of a magazine I was working for said, Simon, the British know nothing about Europe. So can you write 6 pieces, go with a photographer, journeys across Europe, anywhere you like. This was back in the day when newspapers spent money like drunken sailors, and go by any form of transport you like. So we sailed a sailing boat from Stockholm to Helsinki. I rode a horse through the Black Forest of Germany. I walked from Cadiz in Spain to Gibraltar. I took the train from Victoria Station in London to the Victoria Hotel in Brieg in Switzerland. I rode a motorcycle from Munich to Turin. And then I was having lunch with the photographer I worked with. And I said, well, now we've got to drive a car from the westernmost point of Europe, which is a place called the Point de Cossen in northern Finistère, to where the Volga meets the Caspian Sea, which is Astrakhan in then the Soviet Union. And so I had at the time a Volvo station wagon, which I had actually bought in America and brought over to England. And I said, Patrick, I'm not terribly keen on driving the Volvo. It's a bit clunky and old. Why don't we get a Rolls Royce? And I was in a club in London. I went down, obviously well on in drink at lunch. So I went down to the phone in the lobby and phoned Rolls Royce, and who I'd never had any dealings with before, and said, my name's Winchester and I'm working for the Sunday Times in London. We've got this scheme to drive a car from Finistère to Astrakhan. Any chance of getting a Rolls Royce? And instead of sort of falling off his chair with amusement, he said, I'll ring you back in half an hour. And he rang back and said, well, you're in luck, because there's a cancelled order on the production line at the moment. And it's a Silver Spirit, I think it was called, in ocean blue with white interior. I'm obviously not going to say, oh, I'm sorry, but white interior, I can't possibly take it. And I said, well, yeah, that'd be absolutely lovely. So we went up, my son and I, my oldest son, to Rolls-Royce and picked the car up the next day. And I mean, it was the most stunning machine, heavy as lead, but operated like the fastest sports car you can imagine. And it was a tremendous, well, it was RRM1 was the registration number, obviously Rolls-Royce Motors 1. But when we parked outside the Sunday Times office, they assumed Rupert Murdoch had just taken the paper over, that this was Rupert Murdoch's car. So no parking tickets were ever given to it. And I lived up in the countryside in Oxfordshire, and everyone assumed that Roger Moore was coming to stay with us. So, anyway, so the car was wonderful. So the success of this, the image that was used in the Sunday Times, and this sort of isn't an aside because I will make it more relevant in about another 2 minutes. We were in Kiev, which in those days we called Kiev. We know it's Kiev now. And there is, like the Mussorgsky piece of music, there is a great gate of Kiev at the end of the Khreshchatyk, which is the main drag. And we went through the gate in this mighty machine, And Patrick noticed on the wall was a huge poster of Lenin pointing in the distance to the glories of a socialist future. So we parked the car under it, gleaming, glistening, blue thing, and I sat on the hood pointing to the glories of a capitalist future. Screw communism, you know. And that was the picture that was used on the cover. And the result of that, the next piece, I'm now remembering which year it was, because the next piece, it was a different photographer. I was in Los Angeles doing a piece for because it was the Olympics that year. And so the editor of the magazine wanted a piece of the sort of seedy underbelly of Los Angeles. So I flew over and checked into the, what's it called, the big hotel on Wilshire Boulevard where Bobby Kennedy was shot. Anyway, and when I checked in, the concierge said, "Oh, there's an envelope for you." And it was a little brown envelope with keys to another Rolls-Royce. So pleased with Rolls-Royce. I kept being given these. I wanted to say, no, it's enough already. It culminated about, I don't know, 15 years ago, I suppose. And Rolls-Royce, by then having been taken over, had produced a model called the Silver Seraph, S-E-R-A-P-H. So I went to the factory, as usual, and picked up this machine, which, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars it would cost. And I was putting a bag in the back, and I was shutting the, what do you call it, the bonnet, the boot, trunk, sorry, and rubbed my finger accidentally along the chromium outer part of where the number plate was, and I suddenly felt a pain, and there was a drop of blood on my finger. And it's because there was one screw which hadn't been properly screwed in, and it was standing proud of the number plate. And I thought that never would have happened in the old days. There was no possibility, but the standards at Rolls-Royce are going down. And in fact, in a few minutes, if I don't know, I may be going on a bit long, I'll tell you another Rolls-Royce story, nothing to do with cars, but with aeroplane engines, which shows that Rolls-Royce is not what it once was. There's this strange, and I promise I will stop talking about Rolls-Royces, except that when I drove the car, this was a really new car, which no one had ever seen before. This was a sort of pre-production model. And I went to the motorway. I was going down to meet someone in Cornwall in it. And I stopped to get a cup of coffee at a gas station. And I went in. And when I came out, there was a huge crowd of people around the car. I mean, lots and lots of people. And I put the key in the lock of the car, and sirens went off and lights were flashing, and it was going completely mad. And there was some horrible man with his arms folded who simply said, "So it's not your car then?" Yes, all right. Anyway, enough of Rolls-Royces. But so that was Henry Royce's view of what cars should be. Henry Ford was quintessentially the opposite. He said, no, America is a wonderful country. Here I am sitting by then he was in Michigan, and I've been, he said, you know, to the Grand Canyon of the Rocky Mountains. I've been to see the leaves of New England in the autumn time. Everyone should be able to see that. We need to make a car for the people. We want a car which is produced at scale, very, very low cost. So we will use these techniques, which have been now improved over the last half century. And he built this enormous factory, the River Rouge factory, where iron ore carriers came in from, you know, with taconite from the Minnesota mills. They would turn it into iron and went through all the processes of the rolling mills and so forth, and then turn it into cars. And they had these production lines with, on the upper floor, all the bits, you know, carburetors and brakes and calipers and steering wheels, all exactly the same in baskets up above the production line and down below, moving very, very slowly with pieces. And the chutes would be, this is where the steering wheel comes down, and this is where the carburetor comes down, and they would all fit perfectly into the car as it was going down the production line, except of course if one piece didn't, if it wasn't a truly interchangeable part because someone had screwed up with the making of it, then the production line would stop and everyone would get annoyed until it started again. And he was able to produce cars, of course the classic one is the Model T, $257 a piece. And so they suddenly became hugely popular. And American roads were clogged with people going off to see the leaves and go off to see the Grand Canyon and the Great Lakes and all the rest of it. So the differing philosophies were, to me anyway, very interesting indeed. It indicates this sort of bifurcation of attitudes to precision. So, and of course, while 3/4 of the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts are still not only in existence, but are still running, you cannot say the same for the Model T. The one thing you can say for the Model T is that it was initially $270 per car, but while the cost of labour went up, so the cost of the car went up. And by the time the production of the Model T ended in the 1930s, they were sort of $800 and $900 a piece. Not exactly a fortune, but it showed that the Ford Motor Company could become extremely rich by charging a lot for something that actually was worth relatively little. So that is, I'll just look back at these notes of mine, Henry Ford, Royce. Yes. Okay, so this brings me back to Rolls-Royce, but in a very different context. Everything about these machines that are being built demands greater and greater precision in their manufacturing, because machines were getting more complicated, they did more things, and to do them well needed devices to be made much more precise. I won't really go into it in great detail because I don't have the time, but there comes a point where mechanical precision begins to run up against the reality of the materials you're using. And a classic case came in November 2010 when a fully laden Qantas A380, you know, the really big Airbus, double-decker Airbus, was taking off from Singapore on its way to Sydney. And as you know, I mean, you take off from Singapore, from Changi Airport, and it was going, I think, at a fairly leisurely pace. It spooled its huge engines. They're Rolls-Royce, once again, Rolls-Royce Trent 900s, really, really powerful engines, up to full power, taking off, got up to about 7,000 feet, beginning to level off over one of the Indonesian islands, because they're going to be flying, of course, over Indonesia, when a huge explosion from the, I think it was the number 2 engine, the inboard port side engine. And they had no idea what had happened. By great good fortune, they had 5 pilots in the cockpit. There was a check pilot and a training check pilot and a superintending pilot. And so the engine was basically blown up. It was a chaos. And it had fractured innumerable hydraulic lines in the explosion. Debris had peppered mercifully not into the passenger cabin in any way. They weren't very high up, 7,000 feet. But the plane was very difficult to control. But they did control it. And it took a long time, and they made a long and lazy turn off to the left, and eventually it landed back at the airport again. The brakes were, at least on the left side, were completely shot. And they just stopped at the end. I think the runway was 4 miles long. But then the engine, the damaged engine, was still running, and it wouldn't stop. And everything with the brakes were white hot, and everyone was afraid that the whole passengers were still sitting there. Now you're back in Singapore, but the whole thing might blow up. Well, it took about 2.5 hours for the firefighters to cool the engine sufficiently down that in the end it drowned itself in foam and stopped, and everyone was let off, and they'd had a flight. And so Qantas grounded all its A380s and sent a very stiff note to Rolls-Royce, and Rolls-Royce, not unsurprisingly, investigated what had gone wrong. And they looked at the flight records of this plane. It had come initially from Los Angeles, not fully loaded. It had a moderately soft landing at London Heathrow. Then it took off with a full load, 459 passengers, I think it was, and landed very heavily in Singapore. So they suspected that something had fractured, gone wrong inside the engine. And meticulously, they took it all apart, and they found a pipe in the very center, the hottest part. Interesting, okay, another brief aside, which will be, I was fascinated by the turbine blades in a specifically a Rolls-Royce engine, because they operate at a temperature which is higher than their melting point, the melting point of that metal. So how on earth do you get a turbine blade in an engine to spin around and do what turbine blades do in an atmosphere which they should be melting? And so I went to Rolls-Royce and looked around the factory, and you probably all know this, but I didn't. They actually have, into the core around which the rotors are rotating, they have a pipe which introduces air into the rotor blades, and there are thousands of tiny little holes on the surface of these blades. The blades are about that long, made of sort of titanium, but not entirely titanium. Thousands of holes, and the air comes out of these holes and forms a layer, maybe 1/10 of a millimeter thick as it's rotating, and keeps the blades cool as they're rotating so that they don't melt. It's an extraordinary piece of technology. And I came away amazed. And I was going that night down to my old college at Oxford, and because I'm a fellow of the college, I was sitting at high table. So with some amazingly clever people. The American ambassador to somewhere sitting beside me, an archbishop or something in front of me, a woman who's reputed to be the cleverest woman in England sitting opposite me, and a number of other really bright people. And I'm like a schoolboy. I'm saying, I've just seen the most remarkable thing up at the Rolls-Royce blade development unit up in wherever it was, Crewe or somewhere. And so I'm telling them about what I've just told you, that the excitement of realizing that you can actually have a layer of air surrounding a blade operating at sort of 1500 Celsius when the thing should be melting at 1300. They were all sort of politely amazed. They thought, why on earth is this chap being made a fellow of the college? But then there was one of those awkward and momentary silences, and 3 or 4 people away from me was the master of the college, now dead chap, an engineer called Roger Ainsworth. And everything went silent. And he said, he had a Yorkshire accent, he said, actually, Simon, I invented that. It was such a wonderful sort of Oxford moment, you know, of these really clever people doing extraordinary things. So anyway, it turned out that in this area where there were the turbine blades, a tiny pipe about the diameter of a drinking straw had been machined 1/100th of a millimeter too thin. The wall of it was too thin, and the heavy landing, particularly the one in Singapore, had made a tiny crack in it, and this oil, an extraordinarily high temperature, just leaked out of it, sprayed out of it, instantly caught fire, melted the turbine blades, now destroying their source of air, and the whole thing blew up. So mechanical precision has limits, which is the point I'm trying to make here. I then talk about, in the book, about electronic precision, and I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole, because particularly with AI and all these things that are happening, that is an unbelievably complex world. I will say, however, that my phone, this is a new one, a 16 iPhone, it has a chip in it. I forget what it's called now, but let's call it the A4, which was certainly what was in the 14. That has, well, let me back up. The transistor, which I think we can probably all agree is the most important invention of the 20th century, was invented in 1948 in New Jersey by 3 engineers at Bell Labs who deservedly got the Nobel Prize for it. And the original one, which is in a sort of vitrine, you can see it in the museum, is about the size of a child's hand, with a number of wires coming out of it. They've reduced the size and reduced the size, such that in this, there's a chip in here with 4.5 billion, not million, billion transistors in it. It is said, and I believe this to be true, in fact I now know it to be true, that there are more transistors working in the world today than there are leaves on all the trees in all the world, which is an extraordinary. I mean, just my wife and I driving up 91 today and looking, I mean, Vermont and New Hampshire is all trees. I mean, but we're talking about all the trees in all the world. There are more transistors. So the levels of tolerance, and of course that's what the current president is talking about, the new fabs that are going up for Intel and so forth in places like Arizona. That's all part of this extraordinary revolution. So I wanted to say something about what seems to be a theme of this book, which is this constant tug between craftsmanship, Rolls-Royce, craftsmanship of the men who made the blocks in the south of England in their back kitchens back in the 18th century, and today. And there's a rather good illustration of it, I think, in Japan. Seiko, you'll all probably be familiar with Seiko, who make wristwatches. Well, they have come to terms with this. Japanese are still very keen on things which are not necessarily precise, but which are structured according to the imperfections of nature. They make things of bamboo, and of course their houses are often made to withstand the effects of tsunamis, or not so much tsunamis, but certainly earthquakes. And so they're flexible, they're sort of fuzzy, if you like, in their building. And Seiko has got a very good example of this. If you go to their factory, which is in northern Honshu, they have a production line which produces the quartz watch movement. I mean, you're familiar with quartz movements, which uses the oscillation of a quartz crystal under the influence of an electric current, and it oscillates at a very regular interval, and so you can derive time from it. Well, they patented that, but allowed everyone, so they derived no money from making, from allowing other manufacturers to use their movements. And so they have a plant which makes these things. And I think they churn out, it's very noisy, tiny little things. They use interchangeable parts to make them, of course. And they make, I think, about 25,000 a day. So you can go to the production line and watch it, and it's not exactly as interesting as watching motor cars being produced, but it is interesting. But then they take you through, on the same floor, a series of sort of leather-covered sound insulating doors, and it gets quieter and quieter, and the chattering away of the production line sort of disappears. And you come into a different area of the same Seiko factory, but here there are people, men and women, with white coats on and magnifying glasses over their eyes, making by hand wristwatches, which they've been doing for years. They're called the Grand Seiko, and they have mainsprings and jewels, and they're put together by hand. And Grand Seikos, you can buy them here, they outperform all Swiss high-precision watches by a factor of 10 or 20, I think. They're such brilliant devices, but lovingly made by hand. And that's because Seiko has this reputation. They'll stand behind their watches and have for generations past. But they realized that watches that were made in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they had, until they made this management decision a few years ago, there was no one left alive who was capable of repairing them. Yes, we'd love to stand behind our guarantee, but there's no one that knows how to repair your 1920s watch. So they decided to train a new cohort of people who are fascinated by precision and hand craftsmanship. And so they employ 40 or 50 such people who work, and it's fascinating to see them. They're working away at tiny little tolerances, making these beautiful watches, and every 15 minutes the whole class gets up and does calisthenics, and then they sit down and work again. And the result, and I said laughingly at reception on the way out, I said, I'd love to buy a Grand Seiko, because they're awfully expensive. They said, well, we would sell you one. I said, I tell you what, and I don't have it on, I left it at the hotel, but I've got a Rolex, which I've had for the last 50 years. No, we don't think so. Thanks very much indeed. Rolex, as far as we're concerned, is complete rubbish. So I think that's probably all I've got to say. I was going to say something about, no, Japanese, they've got that. Oh, that's right. Well, what I was going to say required me to demonstrate something that I know I haven't brought with me. But Colin Povey, who you may remember I mentioned at the very beginning, who's this glass blower, I never met him until I was giving a talk right in the early days of doing publicity for this book in 2017 or 2018. And he turned out, I was at a bookstore in Washington, D.C., and he had flown up from Florida because I was extolling, I was saying, this man I've never met. He said, well, you have now. He said, because I'm sitting in the third row. And he had brought a gift, what I was going to show you. And does anyone know what a Klein bottle is? You know what a Klein bottle is. Well, he had made me a Klein bottle. A Klein bottle is, it's a three-dimensional version of a Mobius strip. As you know, a Mobius strip is a piece of paper which you join the two ends, but before you join them, you turn it over once and then glue it together. So it's something with just one surface. Similarly, a Klein bottle is a three-dimensional thing of blown glass, which has only got one surface. It's an extraordinary thing. It's completely useless, and it's completely imprecise, but it is lovingly made, and what I normally do is I bring it out and show it. So just imagine in my hand there's a Klein bottle. And I'll say, but it is what is often forgotten in the world of accuracy and precision. It's handmade, it's useless, but it's beautiful. So with that, I'm going to open this to any questions anybody might have, and I'll do my best to answer them. So thank you very much. Oh, wait a minute. Where's Devon? So can you turn on the television or whatever? I want to show you something. Has that been up all the time? Yes. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Well, can you turn up the sound? So I should say this book, perhaps don't let me have another couple of seconds to talk. It must have been about March last year, so now 2023, I got a call from a publisher in China called Cheers, like the bar in Boston. And they make a thing of publishing books by American and British authors. And they had fallen in love with this book. And I had no idea, but they said, will you come and tour for it? And so Setsuko and I, where is Setsuko? He disappeared. Oh, there you are, right. And so they flew us over to tour for the book, just like an American book tour, to two towns in Shenzhen and Dongguan in southern China, and then Suzhou and Shanghai, and then Beijing at the end. And well, this would be sort of self-explanatory, but the part in southern China was amazing, so far away, and let's... So this is the chateau where the library was that we looked at yesterday. There's Setsi looking awestruck from a bridge in... What country is the bridge in? We're also in France, are we? It's a bit difficult to know. We're in Italy, and this is Verona or somewhere. Yeah. So there's a bridge which we're probably going to walk over in a second. It's like one of the bridges in Florence, with famous people from history ranged along the buttresses. I mean, it's quite unbelievable that we're in a relatively small town in southern China, and all of this has been created in the last 5 years. So let's go up here and see what we can find. But this isn't sort of, I mean, it is faux, but it's not plastic. The materials are not cheap. It's real stones, real cobbles, real marble, real... I mean, just look at it. So there's Pacific Coffee, one giveaway that this is sort of modern. And there is, well, there's another church tower, and behind it a hill, and that looks very much like the hills of Hong Kong, and I suspect it probably is. I'm not quite sure, because it's cloudy, what direction we're looking in, but that could be the sort of the northern hills of the New Territories. And this is the bridge, and in the distance you can see the skyscrapers of this. Oh no, of course that couldn't have been Hong Kong, sorry, because we're in Dongguan, we're not in Shenzhen anymore. And I think you will agree with me that this is one of the most extraordinary creations you're ever likely to see. I'll repeat it, a small town in southern China, and as the headquarters actually the secondary headquarters of Huawei. The founder, this man called Ren Zhengfei, has conceived this extraordinary campus, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres, surrounded by the modern buildings of the city, but in it, these replicas of great buildings, in this case, France. Is it not remarkable? There we are. So, Ren Zhengfei, he runs Huawei, and you may remember that Huawei got into frightful trouble with the Americans for all sorts of making all sorts of things which we don't, or the State Department doesn't want in this country. They make electric vehicles, they make mobile phones, they've got a lock on the very high visibility electronic industry in China. And I must say, when we got the invitation, I didn't realize that they wanted part of the action. In other words, I was to speak at various institutes, of which that one in Dongguan is one. It's basically that huge French chateau, which is modeled on, I forget which one, houses the library. I mean, 100 or 200,000 beautiful books. And all these buildings are populated by the techies who work for Huawei. And they were incredibly generous and incredibly nice. And we sat down for a couple of hours lunch with the great man. And he is an extraordinary figure, yet barred from the United States. His daughter, I think it was arrested by the Canadians, who they were going to do all sorts of dreadful things to her. And she ended up humiliatingly having an ankle band put around her leg and so forth, so she wouldn't run away, but was eventually let go. And it was embarrassing. Why the Americans, I don't understand it, are so suspicious of Huawei. But anyway, I was afraid that when I arrived back at Kennedy, there would be men who would say, perhaps step into this little room and have a chat, but they seem perfectly easy with it. So we're on good terms now, and they've bought 4 or 5 more of my books. I don't think Huawei will be involved. But the interesting thing is that I would give these lectures to young Chinese entrepreneurial types and students, and they would ask, and I hate to be rude or to say anything which might, no, I'm not going to say it. They would ask the most intelligent questions. And they would ask things like, is the progress of precision a matter of evolution or revolution? And I thought, this is a really great question. And so I have great respect for China. I lived in Hong Kong for 13 years and went a great deal to China. And I don't regard China as in any way anything other than a staunch competitor with America, which I think America needs, but certainly not a villain, certainly not a foe anyway. But people to be taken very seriously, and they're very interesting, and they're very interested in precision engineering. So I will leave that now, and if there's anything I can answer for you, I'd love to have a bash, so fire away, please. Ma'am.
You described the 3 parts of writing a book as the idea, the structure, and the writing.
Yes.
I'm really interested, especially for a former journalist, that you didn't include reporting on your list, because I've always been struck by the deep reporting of your books, and I'd like to know how you go about it and how you organize your material.
Well, okay, the organization is the key to what I was talking about in terms of structure. So if I can sort of give you an example, I'm writing a book now about the natural history of the wind. So in fact, we were up here 2 weeks ago because Zetsko and I have traveled a great deal. We were in Marseille in February writing about the Mistral, and then went on to Trieste to write about this extraordinary wind called the Bora, and been to many, many other places as well. But the one place I hadn't ever been to was the Wind Observatory at the summit of Mount Washington. And we were talking, we had some friends who live in Marblehead, Massachusetts, staying with us. And this came up maybe in July, that I haven't been there. And Setsuko said, well, why don't we have your birthday there? And so we got 18 friends of mine who live in New England and for whom the drive would not be too difficult, to agree to meet us at the terminus, the lower terminus of the cog railway station. We'd all get on the cog, and then the wind observatory people at the summit had arranged a sort of special briefing for us. And then we'd all go down and then have birthday cake and champagne and all the rest of it. It was a wonderful, wonderful day. But there was a marvelous, and you talk about reportage, because this is already, I've written it into the book, the sort of central thesis of the book, or the reason why I wrote it, is this apparent, somewhat controversial, but it seems to be a fact, that the world is in the grip of what's called a great stilling, that the average wind speed, not the extreme wind speeds, hurricanes are getting more strong, typhoons are getting more strong, but the average wind speed in, let us say, mainland Europe, has in the last 15 years dropped by 10%. And so no one is quite certain why, other than the differential between the temperature at the equator and the poles is less because of global warming. So the great stilling is something that is in my mind all the time. Well, we go up to the top of Mount Washington, which is recorded, until the record was beaten fairly recently, for the highest recorded wind speed on the planet, 231 miles an hour in 1934. The day we went up, not only was it not blowing 231, it wasn't blowing 131, it wasn't blowing 31, it was actually zero. There had no wind at all. And the young woman was sort of, this never happens. Why have you come here? Anyway, so it made a very good sort of introduction to the book. So I try and put as much reportage, and that's a classic example. So I didn't say it in my little homily then, but that's what I do. Yeah. Thank you, though, for the question. Anybody else? Please.
The economist Schumpeter argues that human progress is a function of innovation, always, which flies right in the face of precision, because you must break away from precision to innovate. Any commentary on that?
Break away from precision to innovate. I wonder if that is true.
Well, I guess that's the question. Must you break away from precision to innovate?
Well, I sort of think yes, and I keep returning to Japan. Setsuko, my wife, is Japanese-American, and we've been to Japan quite a bit, and she, of course, a great deal more than I. And there, no one is disputing the fact that Japan is a country which innovates, but at the same time is fascinated by precision, but is not beholden in the way that I think Schumpeter's country is. I mean, there's a country that thinks about nothing other than precision. So I shouldn't mimic their accents, but which is not true in certain other countries. The whole concept of wabi-sabi in Japan, the mixture of precision and imprecision, of nature, and where there are no straight lines and all the rest of it. So it's a very interesting question, and it is just the kind of question that, well, I would have expected to be asked by a brainy Chinese person, but are you by any chance a brainy Chinese person? But no, it's a very interesting concept, so thank you very much indeed. Anybody else? Sir?
It was delightful when you were talking about ringing gauge blocks, because I tried to explain this to my friend today, and it was a complete failure.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
You explained it beautifully in 30 seconds. But on gauge blocks, you mentioned Japanese gauge blocks, about $100. Mitutoyo. If you have a lead on these, I'll buy 10.
Well, I have a number of Mitutoyo, some people and they've all sent me subsequently some rather nice pieces of kit, which I got for nothing. But so maybe the price is distorted, but have a word with me afterwards. A few cases of Asahi beer. Well, anybody else? Oh, I beg your pardon.
Do you see any similarities in the social conditions or the political conditions in eras where great jumps in innovation occur? Are there patterns that you see that are the social backdrops for these periods of innovation?
Yes, it's very interesting. I did a book maybe 15 years ago now, I think, on called The Man Who Loved China, about Joseph Needham, who's this extraordinary figure who chronicled the way that China enjoyed these periods of tremendous scientific development, and then they paused for a while to catch their breath, if you like, during which period there was much more artistic development. There was a sort of languor gripped the country, and they were doing other things, and then they got all furious again. There was the question of, well, it's called the Needham question, why there was this huge amount of activity until the beginning of the Qing dynasty in 1644. And there hasn't been much going on since. Well, to which I would retort, well, not until Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. And it all started again. And of course, that gap between 1644 and 1980 was a mere 300 years, which in Chinese history is trivial. It's just a blink of an eye. The question is, during that period of the Qing, was there a lot of this languorous social, cultural development, which went on in the place of the lack of relative technological development? I think that's a field for sinologists to attack, and I think they do. There are one or two. There's one chap at the University of Pennsylvania who's fascinated by this subject. So I think the answer is that yes, the two things, scientific development and social consequences, occur, one as a consequence of the other, of course, but then there's a period where it stops and something else flowers, and then the pattern of civilization is a complex animal, and China illustrates it, I think, very, very cleverly and interestingly. Not sure that it's exactly the same in the West, but I think I'm slightly more interested in China than in the West at the moment. So, and interestingly, I was reading just yesterday that the Portuguese, because I'm looking at the moment as how wind drives the colonization of the world, and the Portuguese, more than any other empire, I mean, what do they say? Portugal, such a small country to live in, but the whole world to die in, because they sailed their caravels all over the world. And these were, of course, propelled by wind. So how they got from Morocco, say, where they had an enclave, down to Angola, and then round the Cape to Mozambique, and then over to India. I know this is non-relevant to your question, but it fascinates me, and they were making progress. The Chinese were making essentially one profound invention every century in about 800 AD. The Portuguese were advancing their imperial adventuring in the world by 1 degree latitude a year from about 1450 onwards. So the development of humankind is indeed a fascinating topic. So, anybody else? Yes?
I've got a Rolls-Royce story. About 20 years ago, I was in northern England, and I met someone who was on a business trip, and he had a beautiful Rolls-Royce, and I was admiring it. And he told me that he had a Bentley, and an axle broke.
Good
So he
God.
called the rental company, and they said, "Where are you?" And anyway, they brought a Rolls instead of a Bentley. And when he checked out of the hotel a couple of days later, the bill was paid for. And he called them to ask, why would you do that? And he said, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys don't break axles.
With great respect, and it's a very well-known story. It's a leaf spring breaking in Switzerland, and it broke, and they flew a new leaf spring over and installed it, and there was no bill. And he asked, and he thought, "No, they never break springs." Never happened. But I did have a Rolls-Royce when I was at university. It was of 1932. It had been converted into a hearse. It was the ugliest car you've ever seen in your life. But then it did break down once. I mean, it was very old, it was very cheap. I mean, it was a sort of student's gadabout car. But it was what's called a 3032. So one of the R's was black, one of the R's was red, because Royce had died, but Henry Rolls, or whatever it is, Charles Rolls, was still alive. And so they're quite rare when you've got one of the letters in red and one in black. And it did break down somewhere, and they came along and repair people from Rolls-Royce, not just the local garage. And they put over the Flying Lady and over the hubcaps, they put little black velvet cloths so no one could see And of course, it just made it stand out. You said, well, that's obviously a Rolls Royce. Okay. Well, to all of you, thank you very much indeed. This has been fun. Thank you.